Hello, this is Rama Lakshmi. I'm here with Anirudh Kanisetti, public historian, author, and the print columnist. He writes a weekly column for us called Thinking Medieval. His first book was a finger wagging admonition. He was telling us that we don't know enough about Southern history. And in fact, you said that not knowing the history of South is like studying the history of Europe by ignoring France and Germany.
Yeah.
And his second book, the Lords of the Earth and Sea, a history of the Chola Empire, is actually taking that argument forward. It actually goes right into the beating heart of Tamil history, the Chola Empire, and a rule which is profoundly ambitious and audacious in its imagination and its reach. Perhaps you can begin by telling me, why is it that so many of us know so little about the Cholas?
I think it really applies to a lot of pre-modern Indian dynasties. If you were to look at the 19th century when the British were going around deciphering the Brahmi script, nobody remembered at that point who Ashoka was. And I think that generally speaking, the dynasties that are remembered historically depend a lot on the politics of the country that is seeking to remember them. If you were to look at the history curricula that were developed in India post independence, there's a very clear urge to create a sense of a unified national history by focusing primarily on the big Gangetic empires. Because you can imagine the curriculum writers were sitting in Delhi, so obviously they're seeking to link themselves to the monuments that they're constantly surrounded by. And I think that an unfortunate casualty of this has been that South India has been seen essentially as this periphery where, yes, it had empires, but there isn't a clear sense necessarily of the continuity of these empires into the present day making of Indian society and civilization. And I think the Cholas are a fantastic example of this. I would really argue, and really my book makes this case, that the Cholas were extremely influential and important, not just in the terms of Indian history, but really in terms of Indian Ocean and in terms of global history. Some of the most important religious developments in human history, especially in the development of Hinduism, came from the Tamil country under the Cholas. The integration of the Indian Ocean world came from the military raids of the Cholas. So you cannot really talk about India without talking about the Cholas.
Let's get to their politics, their template. Their template was one of mixing temple construction, politics, war, businesses, and in 2025, it sounds eerily similar. I mean, familiar to many of us. And are you trying to say through this book that we've been here before, and this is not unique and unprecedented? This combination of religion and politics.
The idea that religion and politics can or should be separated is a very European one. It's a part of the Enlightenment, the church losing its stranglehold over the production of knowledge. So, for a medieval Indian ruler, for example, Raja Chola, he's not necessarily seeing that when he builds a great temple that it is primarily a devotional act. And you can see this in the inscriptions of the Brihadishwara or the Rajarajeshwaram temple, where it is not just the king who's making gifts but also his army regiments, it's also his general. Now, why was it important for this army regiment to publicly declare this, to have this carved onto a temple? It's a way of displaying their allegiance to the queen, but also displaying their devotion to the gods. You have this interesting situation where the entire Chola court is participating in a project of building this temple as a way of bringing themselves closer to Shiva, but also as a way of publicly affirming their closeness before the eyes of Shiva and before the eyes of the world. Because whoever came into the temple could read this inscription, could see in the functioning of the temple the way that the various organs of the Chola state are being brought together to worship the god.
And you, at some point, you talk about these are not just temples, they are temple complexes like the Vatican.
Yes.
Many, many centuries before the Vaticans. You even compare them to the Medicis of Italy.
Yes.
Tell me about, the Tanjore temple is, you said, 40 times bigger, taller than any other temple at that time. And these were just the imagination, the sheer scale and size of it, and also the unprecedented speed at which these temples were being built. Tell me about this ambitious project. How were they managing to do it at this speed?
I think that the Cholas had really one of the most extraordinary administrative setups of the entire medieval period. If you were to look at the inscriptions of most medieval Indian states, you will see that A king usually has a council of ministers. These tend to be fairly aristocratic men who are intermarried with the royal family. But the Chola administrative structure is not just the royal family, but really a wide cross section of Tamil society. They're able to mobilize resources at a scale that had never been seen in India up to that point. And the Rajarajeshwaram, the Brihadishwara temple, is a case in point. If you look at cathedrals in Europe, generally speaking, they're started by one set of people, then continued over the centuries whenever a city state has the resources to fund it. But with Rajaraja Chola, you have this unprecedented occurrence where this king, who through his conquest is arguably the wealthiest man on earth, has these resources. He has the support of a wide cross section of society, and he wants to move them into this religious and political project. And because the connections that he has extend right down to the people who are literally planting the rice seeds and then harvesting the saplings, they're extending right to the people who own the quarries, the people who control the flow of resources on barges across the Kaveri. You're able to move resources at a huge, huge scale. And it is really astonishing to think about. We're talking about a structure that's made of 130,000 tons of granite that is built over the course of 7 years. We know it started in 1003 AD and it was done in 1010. So that means that every year he's moving about 7,000 tons of granite while also fighting multiple pitched battles in every campaigning season. And that just gives you a sense of the immense manpower, but also the reach and the popularity of Chola rule under Rajaraja Chola.
And that's a good segue into the role of women in the Chola dynasty. I love the fact that you focus so much on the queens, Nangai and Kokilan, and most importantly, Sembian Mahadevi, who appears to be this phenomenal queen who has great strategic thinking and power play. I loved how she wielded power behind the throne while the men were at war. She was actually running the administrative and financial centers. So, how did she go about building these temples, and how did she use these temples to find resources for the empire?
So it connects to what I was just saying about Rajaraja Chola. Many of us, or at least those of us who are familiar with Tamil history, have heard of the name of Sembian Mahadevi. In Ponniyin Selvan, for example, she's a minor and very devout side character. We don't fully understand the scale to which very often is the women who are pioneering some ideas that the men later pick up. And Rajaraja and Sembian Mahadevi are the perfect examples of this. Here's this formidable figure, Rajaraja's grand aunt, and he must have grown up seeing what she was doing. So it makes perfect sense that once he gets the throne, that he seeks to do what she did at a bigger scale. So this, of course, brings me to what Sembian was actually doing. And to me, she's such an interesting character because we're able to sketch out at least the broad outlines of how her life unfolded. We know that she was married at a fairly young age, and we can see in her earliest gifts that are made, I think in the about 915, 920 CE, she's just making gifts of sheep to give ghee to various very, very small temples. But even then, the temples that she's choosing are very intelligent because she's putting them in the frontier regions where her father-in-law is fighting wars. So she's very clearly trying to make these connections to local communities by saying, "Look, I'm the daughter-in-law of King Parantaka Chola, and here is this gift I'm making to your temple." And very briefly, I think in the 950s or so, because her brother-in-law dies, she becomes, her husband becomes the king. She very briefly is the senior most Chola queen, but then her husband dies at this very young age and she disappears from the inscriptional record. We don't see her for another 20 years. But when we see her again, she is now Queen Mother and she has resources. And she uses that in exactly the same way that she did when she was much younger, which is to say, here's my son, King Uttama. My son is doing all these things, but here I am in your village. I am devoted to your God and I'm rebuilding your temple in stone as a sign of my devotion to your gods.
And she's saying these in the inscriptions?
In some cases, yes. But in most cases, it seems to be heavily, heavily implied. But what's very interesting about Sembian is that while she is rebuilding a village's temple, she also includes her god into it. So on the exteriors of her temple and on the southern side of this wall, she always has a Nataraja sculpture. And Nataraja was her personal god. But there is also, once again, this implied political connection, because when she builds a temple, she says, okay, I've made this gift, now the local assembly of this village will administer the gift on my behalf. So it's such a great way for her to build that political connection while also exhibiting her devotion.
Yeah, and you say in the book that she was achieving what the kings could not achieve through war. Let's talk about Nataraja. For many of us, through people who go to museums, people who understand art and culture, who look at artifacts, who study CBSE books, we know the Nataraja is the Chola bronze. You call it the visual cultural revolution. There were some 3,000 Nataraja bronze sculptures in circulation around that time. How did this form become so popular of Shiva, performing the cosmic balance dance? How did it become popular? What is the provenance of this iconography?
So the idea of a dancing Shiva is a fairly old one. In fact, all the way back to some of the earliest and greatest works of Sanskrit poetry have descriptions of this dance of Shiva. But the precise depiction of this dance of Shiva changes a lot. So, for example, there's this very famous dancing Shiva from Badami, the former capital of the early Western Chalukyas, where he's got these beautiful, like 18 arms, all held in different mudras. But the posture is completely different from the Nataraja that we are all familiar with. It seems that the earliest ideas of how Shiva as Nataraja should look develop in northern Tamil Nadu, probably around the 7th century or so. But it's really in the 10th century, once Sembian Mahadevi enters the scene, because she's got a particular workshop of sculptors that she's collected from all over the Tamil coast. And she uses them in practically all the temples that she commissions and all the bronze sculptures that she commissions. And these guys have a standard iconography by this point of what Nataraja should look like. What should his arms be carrying? How should his leg be positioned? And because Sembian is a fairly wealthy and influential queen, because she is constantly traveling to various small temples and commissioning a similar image of Nataraja in all of these temples, and most importantly, building this connection with the local Nadu, that you begin to see that even after Sembian is gone, and even in temples that Sembian is not commissioning, that other people are picking up this beautiful image of Nataraja. They're commissioning sculptures to say, hey, we want a Nataraja, and the Nataraja has to look like what Sembian Mahadevi is doing.
And that's the visual
Yes, that's
revolution
the
you talk
visual
about.
revolution. It's the development of this standardized iconography of how Nataraja should look that extends from the Chola court first into the into the Tamil countryside, and then from the Tamil countryside begins to radiate outwards into Hinduism at large. And it's not a coincidence that today, in the collections of practically every Western museum, you will see a spectacular Chola era Nataraja, because so many of them were produced. And it is so ironic to me that not just in India but in the world, we know what an important symbol Nataraja is, but we never think that, oh, such a ubiquitous symbol must have been an icon of a equally influential and globally significant empire.
How do you see the role of the queens of women in Chola Empire? How do you compare it to queens in the other empires?
I think that in the 10th century, the prominence of Chola queens has no parallel anywhere in the subcontinent. And there's a few reasons for this. I think that we have to remember that when the Cholas rise in the 9th century, they're sharing, they're jostling for attention and space with a whole bunch of other power centers. And so for Parantaka Chola, he is intermarrying with all of these other power centers. We know that he had 12 wives. And once again, this is, I think this is weird cognitive dissonance we have, is that we think, okay, yeah, the king must have had 12 wives, but we think that these wives were probably sitting around and listening to music or dancing and playing politics with each other. These are remarkable women. These are intelligent, these are educated women who have ideas, who are opinionated, and who are talking to each other. So you see in their temples that they borrow ideas from one another. And it is not just a question of the mother-in-law having a rivalry with the daughter-in-law. For example, you see the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law sharing ideas of how their temple should look. So you'll see the same plinth of lotus petals on their temples. You'll see like a band of lions that is depicted.
And all this was happening while the men are looking at expansion, right?
Yeah.
Sumatra, all the way up to Sumatra, Telugu coasts, and marching all the way to the Gangetic Plains, all the way up to the Bengal, right? And you mention in the book there's this waves of moving horses, and you say the horses were imported from Arabia and Central Asia through the Malabar port. Um, and what really intrigued me was in that very chapter you talk about how these campaigns into Bengal were more about looting and ravaging, and less about assimilation and conquest.
That in some cases, yes, the Cholas were interested in conquest, and in a way, they're very different from other medieval dynasties in doing this. So, for example, when they expand into Lanka, they set up an outpost in Polonnaruwa. When they expand into South Karnataka, they set up an outpost in Kolar,
But not in Bengal.
but not in Bengal, and not in Odisha either. I think that's very significant. If you were to look at the texts produced by the Chola court, of course, you have the inscriptions that are commissioned by the kings, but also there's this remarkable text from the early 12th century called the Kalingathaparani, which is one of the most extraordinary medieval texts because it mixes magical realism with political commentary, and it's extraordinarily vivid. It describes a war against Kalinga, which is Odisha, and it describes how, as the Chola army is marching, it is drying up rivers with its movement. It describes how villages are being set alight, how flower gardens are being burned, and how people are fleeing as the army advances. Now, I think it's important that we address this. The way that the Cholas saw violence is that it was a part of how their world functioned. For a king to be powerful, for a king to be obeyed by his vassals, to be feared by his rivals, he had to use violence. And we have to remember that a very large army is not easy for anyone to control. And Rajendra Chola himself talks about how he's, as this descendant of the sun, he smites his enemies in hot battle and he seizes their elephants and their treasure and their women. I think that it would be intellectually dishonest to pretend that Indian rulers did not do this kind of thing because it prevents us from talking about power in a realistic and believable way. It's not a matter of shame.
And the other thing that many people in Tamil Nadu and outside also believe that the Cholas had a navy. In fact, you say in the book that there's even a Wikipedia page about Chola Navy, and this notion was also popularized by the recent movie Ponniyin Selvam. But in the book, you say that they did not have a navy. They, in fact, used their merchant vessels to move armies. How did the two work, the Tamil merchants and the Chola empires?
So I must admit, I was very puzzled when all of us grow up with the idea that the Cholas were a thalassocratic empire, that they were ocean goers. And I remember when I was very young reading this Amar Chitra Katha comic where there's this young man whose father is a Chola admiral, and he stabs this Roman who's trying to steal pepper, and I found it like quite vivid and interesting. So when I started research for this book, I was obviously looking for mentions of the ships, and when I read the inscriptions of the Brihadishwara temple, there's all these mentions of army regiments, clearly suggesting that the Cholas love to document all aspects of their military, political, and religious life. But I was very puzzled that there's no mention of navy regiments. And that is not, and many scholars have been equally puzzled by this view. In fact, the great Tamil historian Y. Subbarayalu, who wrote a paper about this, extensively looked at all published Chola inscriptions and has found maybe one or two mentions of what may be naval forces that were situated in Nagapattinam, which was their primary port. But once again, the description is the army of the sea rather than naval units. If you were to look at the claims that are made by Chola inscriptions, they all tend to focus on land based wars. You see a lot of Chola generals, senapatis, making gifts in temples, but no Chola naval officers. So I would be delighted to see concrete evidence of a Chola navy because I think it would really challenge our understanding of how the Indian Ocean worked. The guys who do mention ships quite frequently are the Tamil merchants. And we have archaeological evidence from Sumatra, for example, where we know that the Tamil merchants had settlements. We know that they would charge fees to particular kinds of ships that were coming into port. So these guys had a remarkable logistical capacity. We also know that when Tamil merchants went abroad, they would build in granite. In import in granite, they would bring from Tamil Nadu to Sumatra to Thailand, and they would build their temples in that stone. So they're very clearly capable of moving very heavy loads. They're capable of transporting large amounts of material. So maybe this is the amazing secret that has been staring us in the face that we haven't really thought about, which is that okay, maybe the Cholas didn't have a navy, but the Tamil merchants did, and that's so awesome to think about. That these may have been this extraordinary part in the Indian Ocean. We're talking about people who were not royals, but who similarly had this extraordinary idea of expansion of overseas settlements, and we know archaeologically, linguistically that they pulled it off. So to me, that's the really exciting and really amazing story.
So one popular belief is about the Navy. The other one that many of us have read is this early ballot box. This under the Chola kingdom, that there's this concept of people coming in and looking at the spot and putting in their vote. I think it was called Kudam Olai Murai. So is this the origin of Tamil democracy? Of course.
It was a revelation while looking at the inscriptions from the medieval period. Is a Tamil, and it is not just merchants who are autonomous, but really also villages. You very often have situations where Nadu assemblies are saying that, okay, we need to fix this irrigation tank, so we're going to raise this tax. So the specific example that you've given, Rama, is from the Brahmin assembly of Uttaramerur, which is on the way north. If you move up from the Kaveri as you're heading up towards Kanchi, that's where this place is. And it is perhaps the most comprehensive document we have of how these village assemblies functioned.
So there were referendums?
There were referendums, there were votes, there were committees for individual functions. So you'd have like an irrigation committee, you'd have like a garden committee, a temple maintenance committee, you would have rules for who exactly was allowed into which kind of committee. If somebody was on a committee, then their relative couldn't stand for election to another committee.
And then we come to how it all came to an end. And very mysteriously, I remember telling me about it, and then I read the book, and you said it did not come to an end because of Hoysala conquest or any of that. Chola Empire came to an end because of tax evasion. And when I read that, I was thinking Al Capone, who was arrested for tax evasion.
Well, we once again have a remarkably clear picture of all this happening through inscriptions. You see that from the 12th century onwards, the nature of the Chola state changes. It is after the brilliant 11th century when these military expeditions are happening left, right, and center. Obviously, warfare changes the nature of a society. And essentially, what happens in the Kaveri floodplain is that because of multiple generations of war, military men become extremely, extremely important and extremely wealthy. And this obviously has a bit of a domino effect. We have to keep in mind that generations of warfare also lead to raised taxes. And we have a lot of inscriptions at the beginning of the 12th century where, for example, Vikramachola, who was a later Chola king, receives petitions from villages saying, there's been a flood, we can't pay taxes, can the tax burden be lifted? And in some cases, the court said no, because the court had its own expenses to meet. So what happens then? When a village needs to pay taxes and it doesn't have the money, it has to sell its lands. And it sells its lands to the people who had money, which is the military men. So you very quickly have the situation from about 1100 to 1150 when military men become massive landowners. They are buying up lands in temple estates from villages. They're just like building up lands here and there. While villages don't have an option to pay taxes, these military men have connections, which means that they can do tax evasion. And they do this in all kinds of ways. So they'll, for example, work out a political deal with the king. They'll say, look, we'll support you. We will send our armies to fight such and such battle. In return, we are going to give this land to this institution and you're going to declare it tax-free. And in a lot of cases, the kings do that. So essentially, the revenue base of the Chola state, which was once in these villages, is gradually given away to military guys, and the military guys then use various means to make it disappear from the tax authorities. And so the base keeps shrinking and shrinking. And by the 1170s, you have this astonishing situation where you see Chola kings making proclamations saying that nobody from this part of the country is allowed to buy lands in that part of the country. You have them saying that we're going to sell off all the lands that have been bought in the last 10 years and auction them off to smaller people. But the problem is that there are no smaller people who can afford to buy the lands anymore. And so you see this escalating agrarian crisis with people being unable to cultivate, in some cases being sold into slavery, in some cases selling their family members into slavery. And this creates the political and internal convulsions that allow the Hoysalas and the Pandyas to eventually overpower the Cholas.
And the last Chola king, it just comes, these inscriptions come to an abrupt end, you say, and many believe that the last Chola king just vanished into the forest. What's your theory? What happened?
Well, I think that that might have more than a grain of truth in it. I think that he's a very remarkable chap. His name is Rajendra the Third. And it's kind of ironic that the empire reached its height under Rajendra the First, and by the time of Rajendra the Third, it was already on its last knees. And this guy, he comes to the throne. He rules, I think, for about 7 or 8 years. There's all these political and diplomatic like backstabbings that happen under his rule, but he's also militarily successful. He manages to keep his enemies at bay for a little while. But I think that beyond a point, I don't blame the guy if he gave up, to be perfectly honest. You have this situation of utter and complete turmoil and chaos where the men who owed their lands, their wealth to the Cholas didn't want to obey Chola power and were happy to ally with kings who came from outside. And I think that Rajendra III, after fighting an uphill battle for the better part of a decade, may have either simply retired, because if he had died in battle, we would have heard something about it from his rivals, the Pandyas, for example. So when the Pandyas tell us in their inscriptions that the Chola tiger was sent to roar in the forests, I think it might suggest that Rajendra III simply gave up the throne and
Fled to the forest, retired to the forest
retired to the
sanctuary,
forest, let's say.
retired to the forest. Yeah. You talk about how Tamil became an international language of power and prestige in the 11th century. But later in the book, you also talk about how Tamil poets were used for domestic purposes and Sanskrit was used for their international campaigns. Tell me about all these language politics that was going on at that time.
So you have this interesting situation under the Cholas where, given the importance of democracy to these Tamil villages, you have the royals speaking to the villages in Tamil. But then, in documents that are commissioned in Brahmin villages, especially, you very often see them using Sanskrit language grants. And these Sanskrit documents are called prashastis, they are royal eulogies, and they follow a format that's very similar to what's happening in other parts of the subcontinent. So it's not just the Cholas, but also the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, Chandelas, Paramaras. You have Tamil speakers in South Karnataka, you have Tamil speakers in Lanka, and you have Tamil speakers in Sumatra, in Thailand, and as far away as China.
Because of the merchants were also in China.
Exactly, because of the merchants. And this is a very clear sign that Tamil had become international, that international business, finance, diplomacy was being conducted in Tamil because Tamil merchants were also diplomats for the Cholas.
That leads me to the last question, which is you said that they're so dazzling, the Cholas are so dazzling that we don't need to bring fantasy into it. And yet we are compelled to mythologize history and also, conversely, historicize mythology. As a public historian, how do you look at these two impulses that we have?
I think it's very significant that some of the most influential of the Hindu texts, the Puranas, are explicitly about the past, but it's very often told through this complex language of symbolism and allusion where nothing is exactly what we imagine it was, and there's this cloak of mythology that is added to various figures. And of course, this is not limited to Hinduism. You see this in Muslim historical chronicles. You see this in Buddhist historical chronicles as well. But I think it tells us a little bit about how the people of the past saw the world. To us, the line between history and mythology is a little more academically defined. But to the people of the past, and this is not an Indian phenomenon, it's really a human phenomenon. As you as as memory fades, as you move generations and generations away from actual historical figures, you seek to remember them by associating them with legends and stories. And this explains, for example, why in the 19th and 18th centuries Tamils remembered Karikala Chola, they remembered Hiranyavarman, the patron of Chidambaram, because Chidambaram is a place that they go. Chidambaram is a place that retains memories of the Cholas, but not concrete, factual, historical memories, but a very clear impulse, a very clear echo, really, of what they did has survived, has been remembered, and then integrated textually into, let's say, the Chidambara Mahatmya and texts like that. So, this is a long term historical process. Now, as far as the mythologizing of history is concerned, I think that it also, to an extent, is a political project because we live in a time when we do have hard historical facts. We have hard primary sources, we have the potential to do archaeology, and we have the possibility to build these very complex narratives of the past that was not possible for somebody living 200 years ago. But there isn't a political incentive to do that because I think historical literacy makes us see power differently. It makes us see people of the past as human beings rather than as black and white figures that we can choose to remember and integrate
Heroes or
into.
villains, the grand
Exactly.
scale.
And I think it's very important to us as citizens of a democracy to be, I would I would say, critical about the way we think about power, not necessarily by the narratives that power gives us, but in a way, I think seeing historical people, as powerful people who wanted to be remembered a particular way, humanizes them. It humanizes our political leaders as well. And I think it makes us, at the end of the day, better citizens.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you for this new book. And thank you for continuing to make history relatable and accessible. I guess I will never look at Tamil pride the same way as I did before after reading this book. Thank
Thank
you.
you.